Hello everybody, and welcome to this latest video as part of the RICS Tech Partner Program. My name is Andrew Knight and I've been with RICS for nearly 12 years now. I sit within the knowledge and practice area of the organisation, and my role is to look at the impact of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. And with over 110,000 members working worldwide, right across the property life cycle, from land, planning and development, construction, valuation, finance, building operations, and indeed end of life, and indeed across all the different asset types of residential, commercial, alternative, and infrastructure, data and technology has a huge impact on the way our members work and indeed the way they can deliver services to their clients. And I'm really pleased to have Tom join us this afternoon from SkenarioLabs. So Tom, please do join me on the call.
Hello there, Andrew. Great to see you.
Great to have you on. And before we get into the bits and bytes and the technology side, it'd be great to have a bit of a backstory on you and the origin story of SkenarioLabs.
Oh, absolutely. I don't know if we have time for all that, but I'll try my best. So in terms of SkenarioLabs, I'll go there first. We are a UK Finnish company. We were started by essentially a team of engineers looking at some of the major decarbonisation challenges that they were being faced with. So rather than just looking at individual buildings or campuses being faced with, how do we decarbonise cities? And going, oh, that's an awful lot of work. How do we start to automate that? And really that was kind of the beginning of something where we've kind of continued to build in more and more kind of automation around how do we decarbonize kind of large scale portfolios of buildings. And alongside that, we've kind of also had to build in, as we've kind of developed our understanding of the real world, if you like, some of the financial elements as well. So how can we finance some of these things? How can we ensure that they actually happen? In terms of myself, my background is extremely circuitous. So via stops in the UK Civil Service, which is where I started my career, I've since spent quite a lot of years in and around the startup ecosystem, particularly around the built environment. So I've worked in social housing, in innovation. I've run accelerator programs for startups, which is actually where I originally came across SkenarioLabs quite a few years ago. And since then, I've led in kind of startup corporate collaboration for organizations like Centrica, as well as most recently at Arup. So yeah, very unusual background, I think.
Oh, well, but a nice mixed background and a great backstory. Now, today we're really focused on, how data and technology can be used to address the net zero challenge. And I guess the first thing it'd be great to get your view on is, and it sounds like an obvious question to some extent, but what do you see as the major challenges for the built environment when it comes to net zero and this whole sustainability agenda, which is clearly so critical now?
That is a really, really interesting question because there's so many layers to it. I think from my perspective, there's kind of three main pillars that underlie the challenge to me. I think one is very, very straightforward. It's one that's in the news a lot, especially now we've just had COP27, and it comes down to finance. We know that there's a lot to be done, and I know that our RICS members play a major part in identifying some of those things. What could be done in terms of retrofit in particular. We're very focused on retrofit. We know that all these buildings, the one I'm in today, I'm sure the one you're in today, are going to need to be part of our net zero future, and they're nowhere near that at the moment. But the challenge is who pays for it. And linked to that, I think my second pillar is in some of the relationships and the collaboration across the built environment sector. So obviously at the heart of that, you've got the landlord-tenant question. So there's a major blocker in terms of the ability of one of those parties to invest heavily. If the tenant invests, then of course they're seeing the landlord take the capital value of that building. Whereas if the landlord invests, which of course is more common and really what government's trying to provide, by either in the commercial or the residential sector, you're seeing a lot of the return go directly to the tenant, which is absolutely understandable, particularly in some of the cost of living challenges that we're seeing at the moment. However, it provides a really, really difficult profile for financing, and so it requires for those parties to come together. And the third one, and the thing that we spend most of our time thinking about, and what we see as being the major underpinning, is data. So unless you're able to understand your options and you're able to understand how those different options are going to impact on your buildings, upon your usage of them, upon their capital value and long-term value to you as, for example, an investor or a landlord, you're really not going to be able to make good, well-informed decisions. And so that, for me, is something that particularly can help unify some of those particular challenges around making sure that everyone is informed and giving people open, transparent data and decision making to come together and make decisions.
Now, you talked in your introduction about looking at this at scale, and I guess one thing that's worth kind of throwing out there is this challenge about, yes, you might look at a single asset and make some great achievements, but why is it so hard to get a whole portfolio into that kind of net zero position? You know, what are the challenges around that kind of at scale approach, particularly obviously for an asset owner who's got probably a mixed portfolio, or certainly a portfolio at scale with perhaps lots of different asset types within it?
Oh, absolutely. That's a really fundamental challenge. So there's certain areas of building portfolios that are relatively well understood. Obviously, we can look at residential building types. There's some really great data that's come out of EPCs, out of SAP, that provides you with an idea of how to get most residential building types to as close to net zero as they're likely to get. And there's also well understood interventions in those spaces. Where we see less understanding, in particular, is in commercial property. In retail property, they're much less homogenous. You've got a much greater variety of usage, you've got a much greater variety of structure, and of the components that make up those buildings' heating types, for example. And being able to build up data on those is extremely challenging. Even if you go in with the best of intentions, if you're, for example, if you're the tenant of, say, a commercial building, even if you've got something great like a smart meter and you're able to make really good decisions on your day-to-day energy usage and how you can optimize things like your lighting, for example, which I know loads and loads of businesses who've really paid attention have done. At the same time, you might find it really challenging to hand that data over to your landlord, to an investor, to a finance organization, obviously partially due to absolutely valid data privacy concerns, data security concerns. If I know, for example, when a building is not using energy, an unscrupulous sector may in fact see that as an opportunity for entering when they shouldn't. And you're able to really start to put at risk, things like resilience, which of course is also a major factor for us in climate. But resilience goes beyond just climate. So I'd say particularly the ability of people to get data, to understand data, particularly for less well understood building types. And when you've got a really mixed portfolio, that creates an enormous challenge.
So Tom, one thing I think that perhaps the sector does need to grapple with is that a lot of people, a lot of participants have made some great commitments, some great pledges to reach some really ambitious targets across their buildings and portfolios. But I think that often collides with reality, dare I say it, in terms of the decisions that need to be made, what is practical. What's your thinking about how people need to kind of match those great commitments with the reality of what they then face when they look at their portfolio, they look at their assets?
Absolutely, Andrew. So from my perspective, if you look at what we've done around the built environment in the UK and elsewhere, we've done really well at making commitments, and we're definitely making progress towards meeting them, but there are a number of factors which kind of pull us back. And I'll go through a few of those. So a great example of where we in the built environment have perhaps underperformed, it's in understanding the whole life carbon that underpins your assets. So not only what's the operational carbon usage, which particularly a lot of people who've gone in with great intentions have made some wonderful steps around low energy lighting, much better building management systems, which are much smarter, much more capable, smart meters, again, being able to control your energy as you're using it, and using those things to make much better decisions around the types of assets that you're bringing into your buildings. On the other hand, there's an evolving understanding which started it started around COP26, and really we saw it come into the public sphere a lot more at COP26, and it's come up a lot more now at COP27, which is fantastic. Is that understanding of, okay, in order for me to put in place something like a battery, or much more dramatically, of course, to take my old building, knock it down and replace it with a new, much more efficient, perhaps even passive house building. Well, okay, there's a lot of materials there which have themselves, in some cases, a really, really major climate impact. So concrete, there's some people doing amazing things to decarbonize concrete, and I 100% support them. However, at the moment, the unfortunate truth is that concrete is enormously carbon intensive, and therefore in making our new, more efficient building, of course, we're putting in place something that can be far, far more challenging. The second thing, which I'll just cover briefly, is I think the clashes that we can have between our intentions and our customer demand, if you like. And it's something that I certainly haven't coined it, but it's something I use a lot, is what I call the university business school problem. Universities have genuinely led the way when it comes to net zero in a lot of cases. They've certainly got an extremely vocal customer group who've really driven towards net zero goals, and I think that's extremely laudable. And you can see they've also been some of the first more complex portfolios to move towards net zero ambitions, which is wonderful. However, then when you've got that clash with usage types, you've got a lot of buildings, business schools in particular, very popular for universities to build those in the last 10 to 15 years. And those are simultaneously, intended and very much genuinely intended to be net zero buildings, but at the same time, they're also very much glass heavy construction. They are in many cases unshaded, for example. Not always, of course, there's some wonderful examples as well. And so you end up with a building which is ostensibly net zero. However, it ends up being pulled back by the reality of its usage and the reality of its design. And I think the more that we can get, particularly our structural, particularly our mechanical design in early stages, to collaborate more with clients and architects, both at the design and strategic planning stages, which is where we really see the input of something like SkenarioLabs being. That for me is what we need to see more of. So I think a slight move away from perhaps the traditional way in which some of this early stage decision making and design decisions are made, and actually bringing more decision makers in and bringing more advice in a way that's really collaborative. That's something I see as being enormously important in the way that we make good decisions around the built environment.
And how about, the opportunity to learn from other jurisdictions? Because, my role is global, and obviously you're working for an organization that has activities in multiple markets. And, there's obviously at every levels climatic differences, heritages of different architectural styles, different building pathology. What do you see as perhaps a contrast between the UK and other jurisdictions that you're aware of?
Oh, absolutely. There's some wonderful things that can be learned, and it's tempting, I think, regardless of the country that you're in, to just say, oh, well, our buildings are different, our climate's different, and therefore, we are different. And there's absolutely some truth to that, don't get me wrong. And there's certain things that we can be very critical of ourselves in the UK context, for example, where actually, if we're being realistic, we don't necessarily want to change. Our building stock is extremely old, but at the same time, those Victorian buildings, Georgian buildings, Edwardian buildings are very, very well loved. They're things that actually removing them in a lot of people's eyes would remove the character of whole towns and cities. I don't think anyone's wanting to see Bath removed and replaced with a load of passive house buildings, but at the same time we need to bring a city like Bath, which is beautiful and wonderful, into a net zero future. So how do we do that? And I think in that context, there's a lot of really interesting things that we can learn from. Obviously, we see a Nordic context, particularly there, and in places like the Netherlands, you're seeing great work being done around things like energy cooperatives, which I think have got a really interesting part to play, particularly in the UK when it comes to looking at things like microgrid solutions. I think there's some really interesting work going on there. Additionally, of course, linked to that in heat networks and heat pumps in particular. So how can we, rather than always looking at fabric retrofit for buildings where that might not be conducive to its usage and the reasons why we all love those buildings, where can we look at decarbonising the grid, and how can we look to ensure that we can keep those buildings to a net zero future? So there's some great ideas. Additionally, and something that we're really starting to think about at the moment is, it's unfortunately, whether we like it or not, I don't think any of us do, we're already seeing climate impacts. We're having to think more and more about climate resilience and not just how do we mitigate climate change. We are seeing a warming climate. We're seeing more extreme weather events. And those are things where, in particular, the UK, which is an extremely temperate climate for as long as most of us can remember, we're having to see, okay, how do we deal with particularly things like heat in buildings that we don't necessarily want to see active cooling in, which is, of course, going to exacerbate our issue. So what can we learn from going from the Nordics and their way of heating up homes to actually looking towards the south of Europe and indeed the southern hemisphere in ways of cooling them down? That's something that we need to really learn a lot from in terms of construction, in terms of airflow. We see, and it's something that gets complained about a lot in the UK, if we prevent airflow, we end up with mold. Well, we're also going to have to look at how do we ensure sensible, healthy airflow when we're seeing very, very warm houses, to ensure that we make those good places and healthy places and pleasant places to live. So yeah, there's a huge amount. I wish I could give you more and more examples because it's such a fascinating area. It really is.
Indeed. One thing you touched on a little bit earlier, Tom, was the ever-present criticality of data, and it'd be good to get your thoughts on how well the sector is doing about creating the right kind of data, because there's always a danger. Not everything that measured matter. Not everything that can be measured matters, and everything that it's that criticality of are we recording the right information, or are we getting too much data or the wrong kind of data?
That's such a major challenge, I think, that is only actually coming to the fore at the moment. I think if you'd have asked me that question maybe only a few years ago, I'd gone, no, we should have loads of data, we should collect everything, leaving aside personal data, of course. And I think having seen the impacts, particularly some of the positive impacts, by the way, of things like smart meters, of IoT devices, BMS systems, there's loads and loads of great uses for that. 10-second data can help you understand how you can save constantly on your operational energy usage, which is brilliant. That's a really, really major thing that we can do, and I think it's particularly important in the business context. We see huge amounts of wastage. Everyone talks about lights in empty offices, and it's a cliche for a reason, because it's a big deal. But unheated buildings, that's invisible. But again, you're seeing buildings that are empty being heated. You're seeing that less and less, and that's great. That's really, really, really good. However, on the other hand, we've already touched a little bit on data security, and there is, I think, the problem that we can see of actually another invisible part of our carbon footprint is our data. Some of the biggest emitters by far are data centers. They produce an enormous amount of excess heat. They use incredible amounts of energy. And, where do we think that all of that data from our IoT devices, from our smart meters, etc., is going? And linked to that, and something that I've seen previously with IoT businesses, both large and small, is that as you start to see scale, that's a problem that gets much more intensive in energy and carbon terms, as well as, of course, very, very expensive in financial terms. And so, okay, what do we do about that? And I think there's a couple of things. One is to be sensible about the kind of data that we need in order to make particularly strategic decisions. But realistically, you do not need 10-second data to understand what kind of window you're going to put in your buildings. You don't need 10-second data to decide exactly what kind of boiler you might want to put in your buildings. Of course, you might want to understand what level of integration you might want your boiler to have. That's a different question entirely. you need to understand how that building is performing over the course of years. What's peak load? You know, when's it being used? How often is it being used? Are we seeing peak load regularly? Are we seeing it rarely? Are we seeing massive spikes? Do we need backup? You know, what's the resilience issues? Are we talking about a hospital, a military base, for example? There's factors that are much, much more important, as well as being the challenge of, okay, you know, is that 10-second data actually valuable in that context? And you know, sometimes it's not. You can end up hiding the wood for the trees in those situations. And so that's one thing. And the other, I think, and this is something I'm starting to see people talk about, which I'm really, really pleased about, is as part of scope, well, it varies, often scope 2 or scope 3 emissions. What is the impact of your essentially, you know, what's the impact of your data supply chain? You know, do you know that your data provider is genuinely green? A lot of the major ones, your AWS's, your Microsoft's, your Google's, either say they are already net zero or that they're going to be very shortly. It's, I think, increasingly important for us to understand how net zero does, you know, are they really? What is the quality of the offsets that they're buying? Where are they getting their energy from? And as much as it's not something that I think people are quite ready for yet, there's an awful lot of complexity in that. I see that as being a really major next step of us, rather than just sort of say, okay, we're actually genuinely net zero and sustainable, or are we actually just moving our carbon usage elsewhere in a way that's kind of essentially invisible to us. So
Indeed,
a couple of really major things there.
Indeed. Shifting slightly onto something that I've had many conversations over with, and I know I will continue over the short to medium term, is the link between however you might describe a green building or a green portfolio or its ESG credentials and value, whether that's rental value, capital value, and it's both for the kind of commercial sector and residential, because clearly people want to see a green premium, and they're also in a similar way very concerned about the potential to have a stranded asset or an asset that's going to have a kind of a brown discount, brown haircut. Where do you see that relationship? Because once again, I guess it goes back to data in terms of giving us the attributes and the understanding of how the market is pricing different assets.
That's absolutely a fantastic question there, Andrew. So from my perspective, there's a couple of things that underpin these challenges. So the first one is something that you kind of alluded to already, which is looking at the difference between what we maybe want to see in terms of a green premium and what we're actually seeing in the market. And that's something that we've done quite a lot of work on. So there absolutely are some retrofits, some green activities that really can impact on, you know, your capital, your value, your rental value. But there are a lot of others which, while they are more or equally impactful, they don't necessarily change the value very much. And it's understanding how do we balance these types of activities. And in some cases where, you know, you might, for example, be a lender, an investor, a landlord, or indeed, of course, just an owner with a longer term horizon, that can work out quite well. You can offset against your energy bills. In some cases where your return horizons are much shorter, that's a real challenge. An example I'll give for that is you know, something I think everyone listening to this will understand, which is residential. What we've seen through our analysis is, to be honest, it's the sort of thing that you probably could have come to using common sense, which is that when people go into a house, whether they're renting, whether they're buying, they're realistically 9 times out of 10, or rather more than that, not asking about, what kind of insulation have you got? You know, it might be if they're single skin, but realistically, you know, a lot of the sorts of buildings that people love that we've already talked about, our Victorians, our Georgians, they're not well insulated homes, but they see a genuine premium over, in a lot of cases, much more efficient newer builds. Now, that's not to say that there is no green premium. So, for example, windows, things that are very, very visible, do tend to have an impact, and things that people can immediately clock. You know, those things, we see that, and we see that in our analysis, you know, and I'm sure people see that around the market themselves. Additionally, there is more, and this is something that I would like to say, I know I've been slightly cynical there. There are some markets where we have seen much greater uptake of kind of the green premium principle, and that is around actually commercial buildings. So you're seeing a different kind of thought process going on. You're seeing businesses, of course, typically have a much, much higher energy demand than simply, a house or a flat. And therefore, you're seeing a decision-making process which is perhaps a lot less emotional and is a lot more logical. And that leads itself very well into these kinds of green premium discussions, because you're not just looking at, leasing a building or buying a building that's going to cost you a certain amount up front. You're thinking very much about, okay, we want to be in this building for, let's say, a 15-year, 20-year lease term. What's our, year-on-year cost going to look like, which takes into account energy bills? Of course, at the moment, it's very hard to take into account energy bills, but that's actually, if anything, brought that same problem into much sharper relief. So there's some spaces where I think particularly decision making is more emotional in our day-to-day lives, where green premium is something that I think needs a lot more evidence behind it, and that's something we are working on. But there are some areas of the market, particularly those where people are thinking long term, where there's an awful lot of progress, and we're seeing some great trends.
I suppose you say that the reality is that we make somewhat more emotional decisions about where we want to live, as opposed to a commercial investor doing a DCF, a discounted cash flow, and looking at the payback period and making a much more, dare I say, rational decision based on that kind of approach. And it's going to be hard, dare I say, to get the average house buyer to sit down and do a DCF based on what they think might be worth spending and/or those kind of trade-offs. But I suppose that's the world we live in, and we have to recognize the different drivers that people have in that way. So from SkenarioLabs' perspective, what are you doing in terms of kind of data collection, looking at correlation and causation? And because obviously a lot of these are about the relationships of either retrofit or existing building pathology, what's Skenario doing to add value to this whole discussion?
Well, as you can imagine, I'm very happy to talk to you about that. So yeah, there's a few things really that ultimately come down to being able to put together a well understood and well baselined level of, okay, what are our buildings using in terms of their energy and what can be done? So the way in which we do that, and this all comes from our backgrounds as structural engineers, as mechanical engineers, it's coming from our ways of seeing how buildings work. So looking at building physics. So what we do is we take a much simpler view on what a lot of your members will do at RICS. So we'll take a look at, okay, what's the shape of the building? So we use in the UK, for example, Ordnance Survey data, which is why I'm in Ordnance Survey's offices at the moment. And we then will look at, okay, well, what are all the different materials that are in that building? So we'll look at things like building codes. So, an example I use all the time is Victorian terraces, because as soon as I say Victorian terrace, even the person in the street will go, automatically, I know what that is. It's a probably single skin red brick wall. It is 2 up, 2 down. It is, a slate roof, and in London it's been turned into flats, and everywhere else it's still a lovely house. And okay, great. What else it got? Oh, it's got a gas boiler. It's got sash windows. It's amazing how much you can get out of these things. And so what we're looking to do is essentially take that intuition that we all have, automate it. And of course, as we've mentioned already, in residential context, that can be quite straightforward, a lot less straightforward in commercial and in retail. And so what we look to do then is to say, well, okay, what happens if you start to change out those components? What happens if you look at heat networks? What happens if you look at changing to hydrogen, for example? We've been asked a lot recently, heat pumps even more so. You're really able to change an awful lot around a building, and really on a strategic level. Once you're able to start understanding how much do components cost is well understood, how efficient they are, what are their U values, how insulative is one window versus another, all of these things are very, very well understood. We're able to look at, okay, bringing all of those pieces of data together and say, well, okay, what happens if you in your old Victorian terraces, you change out all, do fabric retrofit, you add insulation, you change the windows, etc. That costs this much, it saves that much. What happens if actually you ignore that? You instead go to heat pumps. I mean, I wouldn't recommend that for a number of reasons, but we can at least show you very, very quickly what that looks like. And that ability to, show someone quite quickly what the likely outcomes of a number of different scenarios would look like enables them to make better decisions. And we've been asked a few times, for example, oh, are we replacing surveyors? Are we replacing engineers? And the answer is no, obviously not. That'd be mad. what we're trying to do is help clients understand better the value that engineers and surveyors bring and be able to allocate those resources into much more intelligent places. So there's no point, and we know that from surveys that we've used in looking at every single building in the portfolio, because you already know, if you were to stop and think about it, that some of those buildings are not your problem, or in some cases they might end up a stranded asset and there's no chance of getting to net zero. We can quite quickly show you those kinds of terms, and then you can bring in professionals with experience and with skills to go and take where you have got more, ultimately more questions. We can show you where those questions are. We can give you ideas to then do more detailed design work to work together and essentially make best use of your resources, both your time, your partner's time, as well as, of course, your money. So that's really what we look to do. And so collaborating with people around the built environment is really what we're trying to do an awful lot of at the moment.
Well, that's good to hear. So, I mean, looking to the future, are you seeing any interesting trends emerging at the way that the market's looking at sustainability now? Because obviously it's on everybody's agenda, but not every solution is obviously out there yet, is it?
No, not at all. I would say there's a couple of short-term trends and there's a few long-term trends that I think are really, really interesting for us to think about at the moment. And genuinely, I'd welcome feedback from anyone listening to come and chat to us about them. So I think in the short to mid-term, what I found really interesting about the discourse from COP27 as opposed to what we heard at COP26. COP26, we did some awesome stuff in setting targets. And, don't get me wrong, some people have made some really interesting progress towards those, but I think we can all agree that realistically, in order to start reaching the targets that we set ourselves at COP26, you've got cities, for example, who've set a target to be net zero by 2030. Well, okay then, if you're going to do that, the time for action is now. There's an awful lot that needs doing, and there's an awful lot of understanding that needs to be built with all stakeholders in that. And so in that short to medium term, I think particularly what we've heard out of COP27 recently is this is the time for action. And it absolutely is. The challenge is, of course, that sounds very cliche, and it does, it absolutely does. But there's a huge amount of commitments, some of which are in law, which we've made. And so we've obligated ourselves to meet those things. And so what I really see happening are a lot more of these kind of practical plans to net zero happening over the next few years, which I see as enormously valuable. I think in the longer term, what I see as being really, really interesting is actually taking some of these challenges up to a system level. So some of what all kinds of interesting people are doing, obviously we see ourselves as being part of that, is building out a much richer data ecosystem. And as I see it, a much more open, transparent, and dare I say, democratized data ecosystem as well, of using open data and opening up more data as well, which I see is really promising. And what I see that as being able to do in the longer term is create a much, much more intelligent energy system and a much, much more intelligent way of managing that energy system. So, of course, you're seeing opportunities for storage, you're seeing opportunities for localized generation, and not just on people's homes, but, we've talked about microgrid already, and I think that's absolutely enormous, and that's something which is going to take a while, in my opinion, but it's something I could see as being hugely impactful. And so, from my perspective, I think it is this ability of data and shared data and standardized data, of course, to actually bring together decision making, both across the built environment and indeed beyond, but particularly in helping us look at, okay, what are some of the systematic changes that we can make to the way in which we consume energy, but as well as the way in which we generate and manage our systems. So that to me is something which, obviously there's some fantastic things going on already, but in terms of us seeing them in our day-to-day lives, that's something that I see as being very, very exciting over the next few years.
It's fascinating you bring up that kind of topic of data sharing and standardization and dare I say a level of maturity. And I guess my next question is almost sort of, to be very blunt, are you seeing kind of asset owners and participants, and I'll use this word advisedly, taking a more mature attitude to those kind of issues, because it is a sector that's very fragmented and data hasn't flowed around it as it does in other sectors, arguably. But are you seeing it's almost as much a a behavioural change as it is a change of capability. It's that mindset, that change management issue. And are you seeing these changes in market participant behaviour now?
Short answer, yes, but yes, but unevenly. So, and I actually think the UK genuinely is doing quite well at this at the moment. So you're seeing a greater understanding of the need, and you're also seeing a bit of a slowdown in the introduction of new data standards, which I know sounds like a bit of a paradox. Oh, but data standards are great. They help us understand things. Of course, there's the old joke of if you get, 10 people in a room, each with a data standard, and tell them to go and create one that unifies them all, you come out of that room with 25 data standards, which is not very helpful, and there's definitely a grain of truth to that. From my perspective, there's an increasing awareness of the need for particularly large businesses who see themselves, in some cases, let's be honest, as pretty major competitors, all signing up to the same sorts of standard, which is fantastic. That's a really big deal. In terms of data sharing, there's definitely more happening. So I think particularly what we talked about a little bit earlier in terms of that realism around what kind of data is useful. So I think the fact that a lot of organizations have been looking at things like smart BMS, they've been looking at things like IoT, smart meters, all the rest of it. From my perspective, that's helped people to go through some of the things that are really scary. I remember, and perhaps you remember as well, when GDPR first hit and everyone panicked. And some people did very well for themselves, setting up and saying, we're a GDPR expert. Good for them, I suppose. But what that did was, aside from, probably kick a few people into line when it came to data privacy and data security, is it really helped people understand a lot more just in their day-to-day business, how those things are important and how to bring them into the culture of our day-to-day work. I think the same is kind of being true in data sharing at the moment. It's certainly not a done deal, but actually the ways in which data has become more and more important in our day-to-day lives over the last quite a lot of years at this point has made us aware of the sort of decisions that we make in our personal and our professional lives. A lot of us have, I have, for example, Google Home, people got Amazon Alexa, that kind of thing. There's an awareness that there's a trade-off between you're giving someone data in order to receive a service. And that's something that I'm really pleased to be seeing more in sort of the professional environment as well. There was a while, and in some cases it's still the case, where people go, data's the new oil, it's the new gold. And there's an extent to which that's true, but unlike those things, if you sit on data, it becomes less and less valuable. It gets older. You're having to pay to store it, much as you are with those assets. But it's also just becoming less and less usable. It's only valuable if you're making use of it. And that's something that I'm really seeing organizations of all sizes kind of get their heads around. And actually, I'll just say the other thing, and this is something that I've seen in the private and public sectors, just the way in collecting data and the level of kind of respect for people who collect data, I think is something I'm seeing grow as well. There was a while where the stereotype was, oh yeah, all the facilities management stuff, it's in like a cupboard in the basement. And that's been the stereotype for quite a while. But actually, I think bringing people in the day-to-day operations of buildings, out into the light a little bit more, and realizing that the data that they collect is that same really valuable data, and that there should be good processes and tools available for them to make best use of that data and record it in really valuable ways. That's been fantastic as well. So I'm genuinely an optimist, but at the same time, I'm not going to pretend that there's not substantial issues there, because there definitely
are. Indeed. So I mean, finally, what does the future hold for SkenarioLabs? Because clearly, it's when I say it's a moving target, clearly you need to adapt and evolve what you're doing to address the problems as they evolve and are solved, and then some other problems have emerged. So I guess it's a bit of a moving target for you as a firm as well.
Oh, hugely, absolutely. So there's a few really interesting spaces, some of which reflect the trends that we've discussed today. So from my perspective, we're looking at how can we integrate with the sorts of data standards and the sort of reporting standards that people are now using. There was a time a couple of years ago when essentially whenever someone asked for reporting, it was just their own particular way of doing their annual reporting. And, there's some great stuff in there, but it was essentially going and redoing it every single time. Now we're seeing, a lot of people start to have genuine discussions around things like TCFD. That's been going from, in fact, that's a fantastic example of this. It's gone from everyone's done a TCFD report, and some of them were like, on the back of a fag packet and really not especially detailed. Here's a graph, it shows how much energy we use. But as that framework has become better understood, you're seeing a much, much greater level of standardization. And so that's something that we've really had to adapt to, but it's been really, really useful. Because as a data company, that's exactly what you want to see. Exactly. It's much more scalable aside from anything else. And to be quite frank, I think it's a lot more valuable. So that's definitely been something we've had to do, and it's something we're going to have to continue to do over the next few years as we're seeing sort of the mass adoption of different approaches. The other thing, which I've alluded to, and to kind of go against some of the positive things I was saying earlier, I think I'd like to raise the fact that climate resilience is something that we're going to have to think about a lot more as a sector. There's been people doing this for an awfully long time. You've got water companies, for example, they've been thinking about flooding since forever, and insurance companies naturally, but actually resilience is something that we're all going to have to start thinking about more and more and more. And so from the perspective of SkenarioLabs, we've been looking at, okay, how can we help adapt large portfolios of buildings in order to bring them into a net zero future? But what we're also doing at the moment is thinking about how can we start looking at bringing them into a climate resilient future. What are some of the things we need to think about? How do we ensure that, particularly very, very valuable, very, very sensitive operations, all kinds of different buildings, are not interrupted by weather events or by changes in global temperatures and sea level rises, for example. So that, to me, as much as it is perhaps a more pessimistic trend, is absolutely something that I see as having to adopt over the next few years.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make there. I mean, I get The Economist, and the article, I think it's actually the week before of pixel time of this video, but there was a very kind of brutal, realistic article that said didn't pull any punches, that said, we're not going to achieve 1.5 as a limit. Therefore, there has to be this focus not only on increasing, getting to net zero, but realizing we are going to have to invest in resilience and adaptation because it's arriving. And realistically, whether we like it or not, in many people's view, this 1.5 centigrade limit is going to be breached. We're not sure by how much, but as you say, we can't ignore it. And I know a lot of climate scientists would rather that we just focused on reducing emissions, but there is a case to be made that these adaptations will need to take place. And as you say, we can't have hospitals ceasing to function because it's too warm or whatever. We do need to realize that a reasonable amount of investment will have to look at that adaptation resilience piece, whether it's infrastructure or, as you say, critical buildings that we rely on. It's unfortunately this year, if any year, has demonstrated that by the extreme conditions we've seen just in the UK alone, let alone other jurisdictions.
Yeah, you're absolutely bang on there, Andrew. So, I mean, if you look at some of the changes that we're going to need to consider with buildings, it's difficult decisions around, do we need to start bringing in active cooling at scale into the UK? The way we've seen it happen at the moment has been in dribs and drabs. People going out and buying portable air conditioners during the last few heat waves, but we've been having those heat waves in the UK now for several years. I'm not a climate scientist, and what the world doesn't need right now is more amateur climate scientists pretending that, we're going to hit, this particular level. But even if we do hit 1.5, there are still changes that need to be made, regardless of whether I think we're going to do that or not. And I think that, getting real about those kinds of changes and some of the decisions that we're going to have to make is a really major part of also how we mitigate our impact on the climate. Otherwise we're going to end up all of a sudden with every residential building in particularly say the south of England, all of a sudden being actively cooled without, us even really thinking about it. It's just all of a sudden we've had a few hot summers and everyone's gone out and installed air conditioning units.
Yeah, indeed.
That's a huge impact. So yeah, it's about thinking about it before it happens.
Indeed. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, Tom, and I look forward to speaking again, because this topic clearly is not going to go away, if I can use that phrase. It's something we'll need to be addressing for probably decades to come, if not longer, to look at both reduction in emissions, adaptation and resilience. So for today, thanks ever so much, but I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you ever so much, Andrew. It's been a real pleasure. And all I'll say, just to kind of finish us off, is from my perspective, while it can sound very doom and gloom, it's also worth looking at some of the fantastic things that we've done in the built environment around climate change and carbon mitigation. A lot's happened so far. I know a huge number of people are really thinking about it, working on it actively, and it's also worth celebrating some of the fantastic things we've done, and then looking at some of the hard things we still have to do.
Indeed, indeed.